Hello and welcome to today's Movers and Shakers virtual event. My name's Natasha Salter and I'm Managing Director for Movers and Shakers. I hope you're all having a really great day. So welcome to you all, and for those of you who don't know Movers and Shakers, we're the UK's leading property and construction networking forum. We're in our 25th year this year, and we pride ourselves in bringing together key players across the private and public sectors, enabling them to do business and create great schemes and projects. And we also really enjoy putting on our events, creating panels and interviews with great contributors on some really thought-provoking topics. And this year we have 4 pillars. So we're covering sustainability, inclusivity, social value and technology in all of our discussions. We think these are really important issues. Now, we've been doing our virtual events since April. If you've missed any of these, they've now been uploaded to our YouTube channel. So please do take a look, enjoy, and do subscribe. So today is our final and third webinar in our series on build to rent. Today is about co-locations, next generation build to rent. We've got a great panel for you. So welcome to Russell Pedley, who is Director and Co-founder at Assael Architecture, Richard Jackson, who is Managing Director and Co-founder of Apache Capital, and Rebecca Lewis, who is Senior Development Manager for Morgan Sindall Investments. And our chair today, Stephanie Barbabosa, who is the Head of Build to Rent for International Operations at Lendlease Europe. Superb panel, thank you so much for joining us. And Build to Rent is really important to Movers and Shakers. In fact, next February 2021, it will be our 7th one-day event, Build to Rent Forum London. So we've really been invested since the start and we really see the benefits. And I think people are now seeing the benefits. The speed of delivery compared to build to sell, the scale of the opportunity in generating, in regenerating communities, the volume. And now what we're discussing today is build to rent acting as a catalyst to unlock mixed-use developments. And we're talking about co-locating with offices, with industrial, and perhaps most importantly, with retail and the high street. Huge opportunity, lots of potential, lots of challenges. Is it fundable? What's the future? So we've got a panel who are going to answer all these questions, I'm sure. And as I say, Stephanie is going to ask the questions, but please do engage. Please ask questions also via the Q&A tab. We really want to get you involved. So please do enjoy. So without further ado, I'm going to leave you in Stephanie and the panel's capable hands. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the introductions, Lee. I'm really excited to moderate this group once again. The last time we were together was in February at the Build to Rent Forum hosted by Movers and Shakers, where we embraced, we kissed, we shook hands, all without fear. Now we find ourselves a few months ahead of that in this world of social distancing, and we're all stars of Zoom and Teams, I'm sure. But that's not going to let us, that's not going to stop the robust conversation we have around our sector. So without further ado, we want to start off talking about the high street and town centers and what a massive opportunity that could be for co-location and build to rent. Given the general demise of retailing, the reduction in the amount of retail space, and the failure, unfortunately, of some of the retail centers. Russell, can we start with you and get some insight into build to rent on the high street? Do you have any sense of the scale of the opportunity? Is it something that you're looking at as an architect and designer? But most importantly, how is this working from that design perspective?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I mean, I think for us, I don't have any data on any of this, but what I do know, and I'm happy to share, is what kind of projects we're looking at now that illustrates this. And it seems to me that it's definitely BTR is going to be in a different place in the next generation and offer different amenities depending on where that place is. And you mentioned earlier the time we were last together where we debated the issue between suburban and urban BTR. And that seemed to be quite a, certainly suburban BTR seemed to be quite a difficult sell. That was only February this year. And now it doesn't seem so difficult. It seems that there is a lot of interest in that. And I think it's really the different places we're going to be looking at. for us, we have already delivered those core BTR schemes around the UK, and there's strong interest in Europe. But we're now really focusing on these co-locations of BTR. And there are 6 areas that I've really wanted to highlight. And I'll come back to it afterwards about the flight from city centres and so forth. But for us, there is the first time, which is the sort of co-locate with retail, which you've mentioned. And that's looking at the large retail and department stores, large department stores, often in historical settings. They have a lot of complications to them. They have deep plans, difficult outlooks, and they have issues with sunlight and daylight and rights to light. But they are definitely projects on the rise that we're looking at, and that is across the country. The other area, which you also mentioned, was shopping centres. So co-locating with shopping centres, you know, not just in town, but edge of town. The issues with that is that shopping centres, of course, don't have public realm, they're private. So designing those new communities so that there's access to public realm 24/7 is a key aspect to that. And another co-location, which we're seeing, and we have projects along this line, is with hospitality, working with hotels, again, in town centres. Sharing of those amenities, and there are obviously challenges there in terms of operational issues, but that's another area. And the fourth area of co-location, which is with infrastructure, which obviously is also in town centres generally. We've just submitted a scheme with Connected Living London on 9 Elms, for example, and that's an example where you're creating a new community over infrastructure. So, I mean, what I'm building to is there's a whole series of ingredients here. And then the 5th one I want to mention is industrial spaces. We're working with various institutions to look at how build to rent can work on top of industrial facilities and obviously logistics. I think that one's called logistic living, which seems to be a new typology that's coming out. And then the final one I wanted to raise, of course, is one we debated hotly last time, which was suburban living, co-locating, if you like, with nature. And clearly that's an area that has really accelerated. So those sort of 6 areas. And obviously all of those will have different amenities, and we are looking at different types of amenities for all those different types of co-location BTR. And I think, and other things that we've established is what happens in, for example, this current crisis that we're in. But the one thing about BTR, obviously, it hasn't got a vacant landlord. It's active and it's positively engaged in it. And I think what this means is many towns and cities are worried about their high street, the vacant shops, dead at night, no nighttime economy, etc. But we see this through the work that we're currently doing, and have been doing considerable amount of, as a huge opportunity for these town centres, a way of really getting people living back in the city centre, co-working, but also light industry, making stuff, artisan industries. You know, we've seen a lot, for example, of retail and you know, effectively craft-based industries associated with it, from cooking, from drinks and breweries and so forth. But we see this as a huge opportunity to expand on the experiential side of retail and plugging that in with people that live there and working with their amenities. So those are the sort of 6 things that we're really exploring. I mean, there are many other derivatives of that. Another one, for example, would be co-living, which is a derivative of build to rent, where a lot of town centres are seeing, especially those with university towns, are seeing students can no longer, after they've qualified, can live in that community. They can't afford. So there are a lot of opportunities for co-living build to rent in those sort of locations, which we're seeing a lot of. So I think it's actually, you know, at last, I think an exciting opportunity for the high street. with all this new ingredients coming through. How it gets funded, all the joint ventures, I'll leave that to my colleagues to to work that out. But in design terms, they're all possible, and I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks for that. So it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity. Richard, can you talk us through what that investment opportunity looks like and how you see build to rent being a good fit for that? The fundamentals really of making a development like this investable?
There's a number of benefits that can be brought to the table as a result of build to rent. I think firstly, just from a value proposition, from an investment proposition, the longer term income streams generate a robust capital value which can support other parts of the development. But I think what's critical is that we can in part create intergenerational communities that can potentially support a more viable, broader development and create a broader economic argument for other users to come and join build to rent in part led schemes. I think there's going to be a lot of future uses outside of the traditional retail that will evolve through technology, innovation, sustainability, that will drive new business models and alternative uses that perhaps we haven't yet seen from that traditional retail. And as Russell said, one of the key things about everything that needs to be produced is experiential. You know, in part to reinvigorate town centres and really where build to rent as an intergenerational product, be multifamily housing, whether or not it be senior living or indeed family housing, we need to help create environments where new communities can be formed and all those associated uses, leisures, bars, restaurants, pubs, co-working offices, the artisan nature of retail, nurseries for children, where we can create and form part of a vibrant economy and community that supports each other and ultimately create a place that people want to go and live. And then you remove partly some of those dead spots that Russell talked about, you know, a daytime economy, but no one there in the evening. And I think alongside that more experiential experience is the investment values that build to rent. And COVID has brought to light what everyone has already been saying, is that build to rent is a defensive sector. Ultimately, we're creating someone's home, and in any given part of an economic cycle, the last thing to go is a roof over your head. You know, people tend to rent more at times of uncertainty. So we're proving just by the rent collection statistics alone across the industry, everybody is north of 95%. And it doesn't matter what type of business model that is, which really demonstrates, you know, a multi-dimensional approach for different demographic price points and product types. So those long-term defensive income streams will result in institutional investors increasingly allocate, if they haven't already done so, away from traditional sectors into residential. And that's likely to keep downward pressure on yields and therefore pressing, you know, a really robust investment value for perhaps a broader mixed use scheme that may have elements of uncertainty, particularly around occupational demand. So I think that we can be a real anchor for a scheme, and we can support that broader community, particularly an intergenerational community. So I think there's many reasons where build to rent can form part of a master plan as an intergenerational community that's of benefit for a whole range of landowners and stakeholders, you know, public and private.
Yeah. COVID is definitely going to be a catalyst for a lot of the different ways I think we will operate and build. I know a lot of developers have been talking about their design briefs possibly changing. We can come on to that in a little bit. There was an article this morning on Globe Street, to your point, Richard, in the US industry media around how COVID, they're estimating that it will have set home ownership back in the US by 5 years, which is a fascinating statistic. But Rebecca, how is Morgan Sindall looking at this high street development? Are opportunities on your radar? And how do you see that being integrated into some of your region projects? And can you share with our audience today some of the critical factors you think are going to make some of these schemes work?
Absolutely. So we partner with local authorities. That's our primary business model. So we work in joint venture we're currently working with 5 across the country at the moment. And as you can imagine, they're 25 years, up to 25-year partnerships. So it's really, really long-term development model working with them. And the main thing that is sort of different is, and I think Richards and Russell have touched on this, anything in town centre is a long-term play. This is not an instant, you cannot rock up tomorrow and transform town centres. And I think that's something where we've struggled in the past, is to try and get the capital that's really there for the long term. Richard, and I'm sure you'll talk about this later, was sort of anecdotally telling us about a scheme putting together a town centre that was in excess of 10 years. And I think that's exactly where we see this coming from. So the main reason for that is basically, as we all know, the freehold and leasehold structure in the UK. Most of the time, the freeholder is different from the leaseholder. You've got small commercial units on the ground floor, sometimes owned by a long-term pension fund, other times owned by absolutely anybody. So we've really got to realign those, and I think I would see the opportunity through the council's use of CPO powers, which have historically been potentially seen as a bit of a sort of mallet to crack a nut as such. But I think they're going to be used much more frequently to kind of reconnect town centres back together again. And then really looking at kind of wide scale master planning, and Russell touched on this, actually creating open green spaces within town centres, pedestrianising areas, looking at how we reduce the impact of the car in town centres. In the UK, there are very few truly pedestrianised areas in town centres. You predominantly see it sort of made for cars, and we went through that period in sort of the 1980s where every single street scene in the UK was designed to accommodate a car, not a person. And I think we're really pushing back against that. And I think the opportunity we have for build to rent is to create a stepping stone of 10 years within town centres. And what I mean by that is not just multi-generational, but truly creating mixed communities. And the problem I think sometimes we face is values in town centres can be quite high, and therefore you've got to go in at a certain price point. But by creating a truly multi-generational community through stepping stones of 10 years, and as Richard says, taking the opportunity that we're going to see with investors really wanting long-term stable income streams and the depression on that yield that will create greater values, that should be used to everybody's advantage. And as a business, we recently, about a year ago, brought in a later living business. And we see later living as being an absolutely core part of these sort of town centre moves, and also the general housing crisis. If you look at the UK, we have a hugely ageing population. 3% of our housing stock is currently bespoke to a later living model, but actually most of it's quite poor quality. And if you actually look at how we're going to house our elderly population as we go through the next 25 years, we have to build more. And town centres are an absolute, Russell and I have talked extensively about this, but they are a huge opportunity for delivering later living in a community. And again, as Richard touched on, really kind of creating that 24-hour stone clock. So you've got people economically active in the town centres at different points of the day, rather than having one or the other.
That's great. I'm glad you touched on the design a lot. So on the one hand, we've been hearing over the last couple of months, because of COVID, the ways in which developers and even operators are thinking differently about their design briefs. So people thinking about more flexible amenity spaces, creating co-working lounges, changing the unit size. Do they need more internet speed? What does the tech offer look like when you have to be socially distanced? How do any of those things sort of play into the redevelopment of town center? Are there shared community spaces, shared facilities, shared spaces that touch and serve that broader community, Rebecca? And maybe Russell, could you also answer that from a design perspective?
Absolutely. So Russell, I think you and I have talked again about this. We've talked extensively about our hub and spoke model when it comes to anything, when it comes to build to rent. And I think my view is the barrier to suburban build to rent has been that there hasn't ever been, or there's a struggle to show that there's a large enough demand in a certain area to really deliver the level of scale that you'll need in order to really invest in suburban housing. And I'm not saying that's cost a piece, obviously we have seen it in parts. But I think by creating a kind of hub and spoke, with the town centre being that hub, with those kind of connections in terms of physical transport connections as well, those physical connections with people, you can then actually see how an investor could get their head around having some suburban family housing, which applies to a different demographic, to that of, say, a later living build to rent product in a town centre, through to a co-working. And I think what I'd like to see, and to truly regenerate town centres, is investors having a much sort of broader view when it comes to the demographics they touch on with their product, rather than just kind of targeting potentially, and I know the sector has changed slightly over time, but kind of high density urban settings where the majority of UK housing stock is not in that space. And I think that's the opportunity that COVID has really presented.
Yeah, sorry, Stephanie.
No, I was going to ask you to chime in. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no, it was, Rebecca mentioned some of the things that we had discussed on a previous opportunity. But I think what we've experienced is there's clearly much more focus on external amenities during the last 5 months. There's no question about that. And what's quite interesting about that, we've noticed, is that people, especially when the weather's good, want to actually work outside, not just play outside. So we've started looking at various facilities to facilitate that. Obviously mindful of inclement weather as well, but also promoting, natural ventilation and various things like that, as well as all the health and well-being elements of these spaces. But I think that's one area that has definitely started to change in some of the feasibilities we're doing. And of course, the other thing is design resilience, making sure that what we're designing for this snapshot in time, because build to rent is, and you'll know this from your schemes, that, and investors will know, they're looking at a minimum 40-year lifespan as an investment period. But these schemes these communities are going to grow and change over the next 50, 60 years. Well, the amenity is going to change dramatically over that.
Yeah.
So we're doing, if you like, scenario planning on here's what we're going to start off with amenity. And this is how it could evolve. This is how it could change. What happens if you're just doing part of a master plan, a small part? Is that the hub? And then there are other areas. But also, day to day, from the operational perspective, yes, we know, I think, well, we're beginning to understand much more how the operations work in a normal situation, but the last 5 months has not been normal. And so there's been a lot of experience. So we've been doing audits, for example, about how you would circulate around amenity areas in times like this, and how you would use more external spaces. I think the key message here is that the build to rent has such a great offer, as much as there's no vacant landlord. They're there to serve the residents' needs, whatever they may be. And from a designer's perspective, it's important that we make those spaces flexible. And I think that's probably the main message in doing it.
So taking that, you can't skimp on the design. You've got to get it right from the beginning, and that helps it to be robust through something like a pandemic, with no need to kind of change or shift things around, creating flexibility in the design in the first instance, right? And thinking through a 40-year kind of build. I wonder, Richard, you've actually got assets that are operational. How have you been impacted by the way that you designed the buildings in the beginning? Have you had to make grand shifts in your thinking, or do you think you hit the nail on the head on design from the get-go?
I think, well, our model is very specific, and we wanted to replicate a multifamily Class A product from the US. And we spent a lot of time in the States, and I've looked at over 35 projects in 6 cities as part of the formation of the strategies, the refinement of the designs and the product. And we went for a amenity and service rich model, whereby all of the spaces were designed to be flexible throughout the day. So we have a private dining room come meeting room, which people can hire out for presentations, or they can have drinks parties there, they can have dinners there, they can have events. So you can use it for a different use in the morning, noon, at night. And we've got a whole range of different flexible spaces, some of which can be hired privately, some of which the co-working and the sky lounges remain open all the time unless it's a building-wide event. So what we found is that we've got more than enough amenity spaces in our designs. We don't need to make any changes to take an advantage of what we think is going to be the new norm. And I don't think now, as a result of COVID, and of course, we certainly didn't plan for a COVID environment, but we planned for in the design flexibility. People are going to want to and expect to live differently going forward. And you don't need to commute an hour and a half each way every day to be in the office. We've shown with Zooms and with Teams that we can operate we can operate our lives efficiently, both in an office and outside of the office. And what we've had feedback, and indeed we've just signed a 55 apartment corporate let, was premised off the fact that people in the corporates, they like the thought within our buildings, people could enjoy the privacy of their own home should they wish to choose to work there, but also they have a much more vibrant community within the amenity spaces that they can go and work. They don't want to feel lonely or isolated. They want to be in around different people. They can hire out the private amenity spaces should they choose to do so. We with Moda have always had a huge focus on health and well-being. We've actually got 2 gyms in our Angel Gardens Manchester scheme. You can go to the gym at your leisure whenever you've got a slot during the day, and there's more amenities and services that support that. So what we're finding is that people are responding well to our business model because we give them the flexibility by employers and employees to have the best lifestyle and create the most efficient environment for which they're going to work. And I suppose we've been guilty of it in the past at Apache. You know, I've seen too many of my friends over the last 20 years really enjoy home working, which normally means they go off kite surfing. And we've been very against people just working from home for no reason, but we'll fundamentally change. We have done already. We'll encourage people, if they wish to choose to do so, to work more from home. And certainly now that we started very gently bringing a few people into the office on a voluntary basis, a number of them have said, actually, I haven't completed as much today because I've just spent an hour and a half commuting, whereas I could have done that work when I was sitting at my study. So I think that in the future, buildings need to be more flexible. They need to allow for that, that ability for residents to have a more healthy and vibrant lifestyle as part of a mixed community within the privacy of their own home as well, should they choose to do so. So design is absolutely integral, and we've just been very fortunate that we've benefited to that extent from COVID, but of course we didn't see COVID coming.
Yeah, no, that's good. I want to get to a question from our audience and remind everyone that you can ask a question there. I've got 2 screens going so I can monitor questions coming through. Rebecca, the first question is for you, actually. The question is, what do you feel that local authorities gain from doing build to rent in partnership or JVs compared to selling the site or just doing their own housing?
Okay, so I think there's a number of reasons why they do it, and I'll list them and then I'll go back to them. I think it's probably easier. So expertise, as you can imagine, and as we all know, build to rent is a complex tenure. It's different from anything else that local authorities have invested in. Then there's also scale and pace. As we know, these sites are complex. They take a while to get out of the ground, and most of the time local authorities have quite a small development team. So to have it in JV with either an operator that's an expert in that space, or like us, a developer that then partners with an operator, they just get that scale and pace. And with that comes a certainty of delivery. You know, they become certain that it will work, that it's not going to be a whole load of cash written off. And then the other point is capital exposure. As we know, these types of sites aren't cheap. Local authorities can borrow from the Public Works Loan Board. However, I don't know if anyone's spotted in the media recently, there have been some changes to what the Public Works Loan Board is allowed to do and how local authorities can borrow from it. So they are actually being actively discouraged from commercial investment because quite a few, unfortunately, have invested in retail assets over the last few years, and COVID, unfortunately, has not been kind to those types of assets. So they're going to be restricted even further, we expect. But actually what we do find is that a lot of these local authorities have got huge pension funds because of the employees they have. And actually what we do find is sometimes those pension funds actually directly invest, but they invest very much as a passive investor, with an operator then sitting and taking that sort of management obligation. So there's different ways we can structure that capital. And then finally, I think it's about the people. we are a long-term partnership organisation, and we are set up predominantly to deliver for local authorities. So we work very open book, and I think and there's a whole load of other people in this space that do similar, and I think that type of organisation works very well with local authorities, and it delivers them the kind of solution they want without them having to, absolutely ramp up their teams.
Thank you. So Richard touched upon the whole working from home concept, and obviously the piece of why that's happening is what's happened in the office space world, whether or not we will all be returning to a corporate office at some point to work. And will those commercial rents go out of tenancy because people realize they can downscale, or they can optimize and make their teams more efficient by working from home, as Richard has adapted to? What does this mean for us to be opportunistic in the build to rent space on vacant office spaces? Do we have an opportunity to co-locate in office, redevelop office spaces that might be coming available? Could you all please bring your unique perspective to that, starting with Rebecca?
Whenever anyone mentions office space, I just think of all some of the terrible PDs that have happened over the last few years. But I think as a concept, definitely we have to, we have to look at things differently. I live in central London, and I don't know if anyone else has been into central London in the last few weeks, but it is literally a ghost town. There is nobody there, and I sort of wrote down in advance of sitting here that we've sort of, I think, in part swung too far towards commercial in certain parts of the UK, and I think it's probably across the world actually. And I think this rebalance between commercial as a broad tenure group and residential again as a broad tenure group needs to occur. And I think if it does occur, we will create much more vibrant communities. However, how we do that, I will hand to Russell from a design perspective to talk through how on earth he sees that happening. Because yeah, as a surveyor, I'd love to see it, but yeah, need a clever architect, please.
I'm not a clever architect, but I think there are a lot of, I mean, I mentioned one of the typologies, the sort of co-location with industrial and logistics. What's come out of those projects we're looking at with others is the fact that it's a multi-use space that we're creating, because traditionally that sector, and I use the term sheds deliberately, because they wouldn't push over a shed and put something else back on the land that would be more appropriate in 20 years time. But as soon as you integrate mixed use and specifically build to rent, where you're looking longer term, that means that other space needs to be more future proof and design resilient for the future for a whole range of uses. So for example, it might have to have, logistics will need 10 meters clear floor to ceiling height to work. Offices will be 4. So you need to design these spaces so that you can interchange different floor levels and different loadings. I mean, at one extreme, if there are forklift trucks that need to go up the lift, you've got to design a structure to do that. At the other extreme, making stuff, makers, artisans that Richard mentioned earlier, making something in a core, they'll need daylight and different spaces. But to be able to integrate a build-to-rent community over this sort of multifunctional design resilient space that's going to serve the needs of the high street. And I see no problem with those sort of uses in the high street in the future. I mean, I'm much more fascinated about how something's made if I go shopping and look at something. I don't know why they always put the workshops at the back of the shop. I'd rather see the workshop at the front. And then if I'm interested, I'll go in and buy something. They always seem to get that the wrong way around. And I think that spirit of seeing stuff being made is much more important to see in the high street in the future. And that gives us so much more opportunity to create different kinds of spaces. I think it's quite exciting. I'm going to hand over to Richard, see if he's got a different take on it.
And I don't think I can add a huge amount to what's been said, actually. I personally, I'm like Ross, I think the I think the world of the chains, repetitive food and beverage chains in city centres and retail chains is over. I think people, they can go online and get that. If you want to attract people to go shopping and go into city centres, you've got to get them to places that they can't get necessarily online, or they want to go see, feel in touch beforehand, and they feel that, there's nothing quite like having something that's handmade and artisan. And I think one of the things that's a shame about the internet is, in some ways you support people because you create huge jobs that go behind it, but also you don't support people, small businesses, in quite the same way that we used to do so. And that personal touch and human interaction, I think, is sometimes undervalued. So for me, I'd much rather go, well, I don't really enjoy shopping at all, but if I was to go shopping, I'd much rather go to something which is more artisan and local and handmade than I would go to a chain. So yeah, I'd always go for a sort of a smaller business if I could.
It's the experiential piece that we've been talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're gonna have to repeat that one. I think I heard experiential. Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's everything. I think people are much more experiential now. I think people owning possessions. I think it's no longer, great for you to take a picture of you right next door to, a V8 car, which goes 0 to 60 in some very fast time, but it's not very sustainable. But it's very cool of you to take a picture of doing something interesting, and FOMO was added to the Oxford Dictionary for a reason. I think that's partly driven by that experiential culture. I'm not quite sure how I managed to get that into this panel, but there we go.
So Richard, is Apache looking at any sort of office or industrial places, or can you speak to the investor appetite for these spaces? What are you seeing and hearing happening in the market with regards to this?
I think, to be fair, we are not a large mixed-use developer. We tend to focus on building very specific multifamily housing schemes and also senior living, this intergenerational communities that we talked about earlier on. So we form part of larger master plans, and for the reasons which I described in sort of the first question, that long-term stable income streams is really what investors are looking for. But we are now getting some interesting conversations direct with landowners of various different uses, because they know with Moda Living, we've got an interesting brand, we've got an interesting model. It's bringing a dimension to a scheme that some other operators aren't providing, and therefore we're increasingly finding that we're being brought into broader schemes than we were historically the case, particularly now that people can see Angel Gardens in Manchester operating and performing. So we feel that we will be part of larger mixed-use developments, but we ourselves are not set up to do those broader developments around it. But I think the more complementary the use, the 24-hour community that can be generated, we can all work very harmoniously together.
Yeah. So when we all met up in February, we talked a lot about suburban living versus urban living. In fact, I think that was the topic of the panel, even though we went into like 20 other related sort of topics. So back then we were talking about it from the perspective of it's cheaper investment, so it's more viable and you can get cheaper rents. But it's more about sustainability and about well-being for people, being out in the open and nature and that experience of that. Now we're in a different place. Just flash forward a few months. People are thinking a lot more from being in lockdown and working from home about where they're living, and people are talking a lot about, if I have to go into the office only one day a week, I might think about not, in fact, living in central London, but living out in the suburbs, right? So there's another reason to maybe think about investment there. Do you think that is going to be the case? And I'd love to hear from each of you on this.
Shall I start? From my side, I don't know if anyone else has been following the Rightmove stats that have been published over the last few months. They have been absolutely fascinating. Rightmove has had the busiest period it's ever had during COVID, with obviously everyone bored at home looking at houses, with a 75% increase in people looking for gardens. And I think, a bit like what Russell said earlier, this is here to stay. We already love the outdoors. We are the home of open gardens and God knows what else. And our love of animals goes very far. And I just think this will just absolutely reinforce those values for people in their lives. And I think most people have had a kind of, you know, I don't want to take away how hard this has been. I can't even imagine for some, but I think there've been some true learnings out of this about work-life balance in a really broad sense. And I personally see suburban living from a rental perspective being really high up the agenda. I think this will couple perfectly with the government's push to build. And the strategic land sites that are going to come out the back of Homes England over the next few years, I think, personally, I think Help to Buy might drop away. And I think that the world of rental will increase as pension funds basically look for income streams. And people struggle to buy and will increasingly push to live in suburban locations because of the reasons you've outlined, Stephanie.
Russell, how about you on suburban locations?
Well, it's
COVID's going to
interesting.
drive people to the suburbs?
Yeah, I mean, we had like most architects, you know, you have a few schemes on your desk that you don't have a client for, and you go along and you present, see if there's any interest in it. And we did a bit of that last year with a few projects that are which are not in core locations. They're more suburban locations. There wasn't much interest. But in the last 5 months, they've suddenly, one of them's literally called up and said, remember that project you talked to us about? Is that still around? And that's actually now turned into a project. So I think, you know, we're seeing real hard evidence where there is that shift. They refer to locations as sort of grade 1 opportunities and grade 2 opportunities. So what was in theory a grade 2 opportunity has been upgraded now to grade 1. And that's for a major build to rent provider. So that was quite interesting. The other thing a point I want to make though is I don't see this as just being housing in suburban. I do see it as a sort of mixed use suburban option, and I think that's the thing. Obviously, if you can combine it with small office space, startup office spaces, for those things we mentioned earlier, that would be a further attraction for somebody who only needs to go into city centre to sell their goods or promote their products once or twice a week, but they want to live and work in a more you know, relaxed and healthier location, and doesn't need to be amongst the clients all the time. And I think that is something that is certainly increasing, and I've referred to that before.
Yeah. Richard?
Yeah, I think if you look at the statistics, in terms of demographic statistics, 50% of all babies born today go immediately into rented accommodation. 35% of all long-term renters have children, yet only 7% live in houses, which is a rather staggering statistic. And it fundamentally shows that there is a lack of supply of, you know, good quality housing product, you know, designed around families. Again, look at the next level, the two fastest growing demographic groups for rent, it's young families and downsizers. So you have this ability to create an intergenerational community. So I think for all the reasons that everyone's already ascertained and outlined, there will be a growing demand for rent in the suburbs. I think that you have the ability to create a community that is just not your own community, but integrates into the broader community more so that you can often do within a single towered residential apartment. And ultimately, I think as an industry, you know, everybody are at different stages of their life. They have different drivers and reasons why they may or not be renting, their lifestyle or affordability reasons. And therefore, I don't believe that this will herald a move and shift away from, you know, build to rent and city centres. I think ultimately we need to be creating a broad range of products, different price points, locations and product types designed for rent so that they are future-proofed or as future-proof as possible. So I think that there's a great story for suburban living. I still also believe that there is a great story for you know, city centre living as well. What I think we're going to see, and what we're already starting to see in Manchester, is a surprising level of intergenerational demand. And we have young families, we have downsizers, we have millennials in there. In fact, 12% are young families, which is not something that we anticipated, albeit we hoped we would achieve. So yeah, I think there's a broad range demand. I think that structural demand to rent is growing, but I certainly feel that suburban living has a much more important plant and perhaps is accelerators as a result of COVID for the reasons that Rebecca and Russell have outlined.
Yeah, I agree. So we've got a question around Proptech. What sort of Proptech solutions do the panel feel will become the new norm?
I mean, that is something that is, I mean, without doubt, internet speed is the first request. And a lot of the operators that we're working with are increasingly getting more and more sophisticated with their technology to look after their residents. And I've got to admit, it's actually quite difficult to keep up. You know, every scheme we look at, there is some other new product, new other way of keeping in touch with people. But for us, it's definitely, when we're designing schemes, it's almost, we do the utilities check. And we do, has it got power, has it got water and that, and also now fundamentally is internet speed and access is just one of those utilities, and of course everything else then stems from that. I think probably the other area where the tech is coming in a lot is actually in senior living, later living, supporting people with all sorts of technology. Which I think is quite exciting, and I think that's to help mitigate some of the operational costs. I think is really where there's a lot of work to be done. So I certainly see that happening much more in the future.
Yeah, Richard, how is Moda using tech?
Well, to start off with, we didn't want to predict the type of technologies that people would be using for their own consumer uses. But we recognized that the infrastructure, which Russell talked about, was absolutely integral. So we put fiber into every single apartment that we have within Angel Gardens. And it was designed from the outset that people could, over 1,000 people in the building could be gaming, downloading, working, video calling, although not quite to the extent that we have been, could do so within the building from the very outset. And actually, my business partner, lives out in part of the time in the Cotswolds, and his internet was terrible. And for the first 4 to 6 weeks, we could barely see him on the video quality. And it really reinforced actually the fact that, our building's got the best high-speed internet going in. It's offered for free to our residents. And I think that is a really important factor going forward. We have integrated as part of the whole journey for our residents. From the moment they hear about us, they go online, they book a viewing, they come and see the apartments, the use of the app, that whole experience for them, how they can monitor their payments, they can track maintenance issues, they can form part of the social media, they can invite people on their floor to have drinks or go to the amenity spaces, to give control back to the residents, but also good overall control of ourselves. And what we decided to do on the technology front was, instead of going down one operational system like a Yardi, which tends to be a little bit clumpy and not particularly flexible for an open source architecture, we have created our own IT platform, but we've taken 9 different systems of what we think are the best in that whole customer journey in relation to the technology. And I have to say, it's working a lot better than I feared it might do. I thought we were being perhaps at risk of being ambitious on that and it not working, but it's been seamless, and the residents are using the app the entire time. So I think there's a residence experience. There's also, you can have efficiencies with your list systems. It's been particularly useful for monitoring COVID, the security that's afforded. And one of the biggest upticks that we've seen in customer feedback is the importance of security. We had a couple of residents that we knew were flouting the rules. We dealt with them very firmly. They stopped behaving the way that they did, and a lot of people felt very comfortable about that. And that was shared on, on social media. So social media, I think, is daily part of everybody's lives. The IT infrastructure that we have for our residents, but also the infrastructure that sits behind that, so we can do the operational efficiencies, which we're continuing to improve, property and the facilities management. I think the infrastructure is critical, the experience for the residents is critical. But I think Proptech is really a word that most of us don't really understand, and I would include myself in that category. There's too many people with a really average app calling it Proptech. So I think it's sifting through all of those different technologies that are coming through and the apps, and actually finding one which is really useful and has that longevity to it, and you can integrate within your infrastructure or indeed offer it to your residents. So I think it is going to be an utterly critical part, but it's got to start with giving people high speed Wi-Fi access that enables them to live, work and play.
Yeah, great tip. Which ties nicely into the next question. So we've talked a lot about after lockdown and COVID, health and well-being is very high on all of our agendas. But how are you designing and incorporating the aspects that people need from a health and well-being perspective into the design of the building? So I know, Richard, you've talked a lot about the tech piece of that. Any comments from you on the general design? And then we'll flick to Russell. I think I'm conscious we have about 6 minutes left, team.
Yeah, I mean, we placed health and well-being at the very center of what we design within our buildings. And in Manchester, on our roof terraces, which were the first thing to be able to open up again when COVID's relaxation commenced, we've got a multi-use game pitch where we can do five-a-side football and multi-uses on that pitch. We have 2 gyms within our buildings, one open to the public, one which is completely private. But the operator Hero, they're absolutely fantastic. They're a new company. They don't have a strong company. They've got an amazing business plan. We've got a cryo chamber within that gym, which professional athletes are now coming to use, and an alarming number of people with hangovers actually are finding it rather a good cure. And during COVID, we've been able to integrate the technology as well with the practical. So we had people were able to, if they weren't in a courtyard apartment, they could go and use the non-occupied apartments. We then had gym instructors going to the center of the courtyard, so we could do fitness programs, sort of actual ones. We gave virtual fitness programs to all of the individuals. We can tailor fitness programs in accordance with whatever their fitness is, and also their food requirements. So we can deliver food parcels up to people's apartments, which is structured into accordance exactly what they want, be it on a weekly or a monthly basis or for an individual event. So for us, health and safety and health and well-being, both mental and physical, has been an absolute driver for Moda and ourselves from the very outset. And we sought to provide the flexible spaces to be able to accommodate that, really from inception. So for us, it's probably accelerated some of our technological advancements in terms of courses remotely into people's homes, but the physical infrastructure and design of the building was there from the outset.
Russell, what sort of amenities are you looking at designing in the layouts of things for health and well-being?
I think it's in our DNA. We obviously they're architects. We set up interiors division to focus on build to rent. We've set up landscape to complement build to rent, but we've also set up health and well-being division. And actually working to the World Building Institute standard, which I know Stephanie Lendlease are very much very much involved with. I mean, colleagues in the office, Ben Shannon, he's a qualified accredited professional at that organisation, and we, in our design reviews, he's very much involved in it. And really, it's the process of developing the design and the merging design. And so it's inherent in the design to think about health and well-being, and you can calculate it and you can get, accredited projects and schemes for it. And I think once the residents start to hear about this much more, they'll be going around, not just looking at the A+ certificate on power consumption. They'll want to know how healthy your design is. And they'll probably be walking around with particle monitors to see how clean the air is, and they'll be weighing that up with the cost of the rent and the facilities. So we all know, from those of us that did a lot of the study tours a few years back in the States, how that is really promoted in that sector. And it hasn't really happened here yet in the UK, but it's definitely coming.
It will. I think I'd recommend also to the person who asked the question. So the WELL standard and FitWell are quite good standards in terms of thinking about health and well-being from the design perspective. But out of New York City, there's also the Center for Active Design, which has got quite innovative looks and studies, case studies on how active design, like building wider staircases with music, for example, to encourage people or high rises to take the stairs instead of the lift. So there's a lot of really good innovation out there. I think I'll just close out in the last minute with Rebecca. Anything from you on health and well-being in your buildings? And then I think we'll have to close it down there. We've got just 2 minutes and no other questions from our audience.
So from our side, it's sort of fabric first. We are the ones that create the buildings that, you know, Russell's designed and Richard occupied. So it really does, I think, start with us. We are looking at, well, we are actively working in so many different ways to deliver these wellbeing commitments. And we signed up to the UN's commitments to poverty, climate change and wellbeing a couple of years ago, and that sort of sits at the heart of everything we do. But I think back to the previous question, for us, it comes down to the Internet of Things and actually how we embed the Internet of Things into our production and our creation of buildings that then allows people the data and the insights to understand how people are behaving in the building, how they're feeling, how it's making them feeling, how they're using the space. And I think by creating a sort of huge amount of data that we can then really analyze, and when Richard then gets the building, he can understand how his users really use the building. That's the best way of understanding about our customers and hopefully connecting us all with them to allow and ensure that they have the best quality of life possible. Thank
you. It was wonderful to catch up with all of you again. I'm sure that we'll be doing this again in the future. Thanks to everyone for joining us as well. I hope that you got a lot out of the session and got all of your questions answered. Lee, should I turn it back over to you for just a closeout? And thanks again to my panelists.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to all of you. That's been fascinating. I knew it would be, and I know we could have gone on another hour, but you know, it's so interesting to see how far Build to Rent has come. We've been doing the Build to Rent Forum in London for 7 years, and it feels that it's really gaining momentum at the moment. And I think this opportunity with co-location, it's clear that Build to Rent is a real catalyst for mixed use development at the moment. And I think the city centre piece, working especially with different retail offerings, is going to be fantastic in terms of regeneration. And it's interesting to see that piece on suburban living really coming up the agenda again, especially with COVID, etc., and that we can really build communities in terms of mixed use in suburban as well. And this intergenerational piece, I think, is going to be fascinating and really important for communities, for mental health and well-being, and all the elements that you talked about. So it's really, really interesting. Thank you so much indeed to all of you. And Stephanie, very well chaired indeed. So thank you.
Thank you.
And just to say to our audience, thank you guys. Our next event is next Wednesday, and it's a midweek refresh, so something a bit different. So free to all to join. And we have a lady called Nikki Perry, who is actually the yoga teacher to Kate Winslet. And she's going to come on and just give us a talk and some key anti-stress aids. And it looks really good fun. And I know she's going to come up with some great ideas for us all. So it's a midweek refresh. And then after that, the following week, we have views from the top with Apex Airspace. So very timely for that one. And lots more to come in September. So thank you for tuning in today. Take care. Keep safe from our family to yours. Thank you.